I imagine a play in 3 parts with a encore, if it goes well. And obviously, if not, heads will roll. The first part will be the opening scene, the searing anecdote of well-meaning government bureaucracy gone wild. And you each should pick, because you've both written so articulate, like almost like pouring hot water on your own poison ivy. There's these vivid vignettes. So I want you to play back for the audience your favorite vignette. In Maine, we have 120,000 regulations to protect the 1.6 million of us that live there. And we add just last year, 2,500 new laws. But luckily, only 1,200 new laws were added to the state of Maine so that we could get those potatoes in safely. The second act will be how we do that. What is the gravitational pull that makes us do this to ourselves? You would imagine that after the needle goes into one's own eye a certain number of times, one would say, no mas with the needle. And the third section will be, what might we do? We have this wrench that has been hurled at Washington by the majority of us, and they want something to get hit. What should get hit? What constructive result from this frustration level that we've got kind of going for us, if you will, might be the most impactful and lasting? 3 acts. The encore will be questions from all of you. So when we get to the end of the third act, please applause and raise your hand. Otherwise, early drinks. No, otherwise, no drinks. All right.
That's better.
So, Philip, we'll start with you, and then we'll...
Right. So,
Jennifer.
Only in the last 50 years, we changed the legal organization of government from telling people kind of what they had to accomplish to telling them exactly how to accomplish it. So what we've created is this ever denser system of central planning. So I was involved in a project to raise the roadway of the Bayonne Bridge to allow the new generation of ships to go into Newark Harbor. And it took a government employee had the idea of not building, I think, $5 billion for a new tunnel, just raised the roadway within the existing arch. And it turned out that was feasible, saved $4 billion, and no environmental impact, same foundations. It took them 5 years with a 20,000-page environmental assessment to get approval, which more or less doubled the cost of the project. Including requirements to do things like study every historic building within a 2-mile radius of the bridge, even though the project was touching no buildings. That's just an example. I mean, at every level of government, California has 746 pages of regulations for each school principal on requirements of nutrition. I mean, we could...
For that 26-minute lunch that they have.
Yeah, for the 26-minute lunch.
And yet still it's a tater tot.
Yeah. So the RFK Stadium here has been abandoned for years. It's surrounded by a big parking lot. They were going to demolish it and make something good out of it. It took 5 years of going through the process till they recently got approval to demolish a building that no one's using and it doesn't touch any neighborhood. So you have a system of government where no one has authority to make sense, to use common sense, in the situation in front of them, and then we wonder why so many Americans are angry.
I will strongly agree with that and probably pick up a little bit on moving us into the why as well. So I'll tell a story, I mean, there's so many stories like that, right? And when you're in the bureaucracy, you hear one every day, right? But here's one from my book that starts in the Air Force. This is about 2013. My friend Weaver gets sent there because a project is several years beyond schedule. It's over budget. And he's an engineer, and they says, go help them, ship this project. So this is a project to get software from satellites to ground stations for our GPS system, which is very, very important, especially if you get lost all the time like I do. But of course, it's for much more than that.
Otherwise, how would you get Starbucks?
It's that, and apparently like everything else, like ATMs use GPS. Everything uses GPS. This is very important. We're spending billions of dollars to upgrade the GPS. So he shows up at this contractor in Aurora, Colorado, and spends a couple days with the team and can pretty much immediately figure out what's wrong, which is, while there is a very simple protocol, I know this is going to sound technical, it's not, you'll get it, don't worry. There's a very simple protocol that you would use to get the data from satellites to the ground stations, and they are using that on either end, but in the middle, they have put this giant piece of software called an enterprise service bus. So basically think about like something very simple, like a hammer and a nail here, and a hammer and a nail here, and in the middle, a giant Rube Goldberg machine that simply won't work. And so the issue is that the data, times out before they can get it. And he's like, okay, well, it's pretty obvious what we do.
Take out the bus.
Take out the enterprise service bus. And they say, well, we can't do that. It's a requirement in the contract. So my friend Weaver decides to go figure out why it's a requirement in the contract, and he finds that it is in the Air Force Enterprise Architecture. Okay, so why is it in there? It's in the Federal Enterprise Architecture. I'm sorry, the DoD Enterprise Architecture, because it's in the Federal Enterprise Architecture. What? Why? Right? Why do we have a Federal Enterprise Architecture?
Never know when you'll need a bus.
You never know when you'll need well, we don't, it's not an actual bus, Jonathan, okay.
Enterprise bus.
Enterprise service, just a big piece of software. So it turns out, if you really go dig into this, that we had a couple of members of Congress who wrote a law, Klinger-Cohen, in '94, I think, someone will check me on that, that asked that we have a plan for all software in government to be coordinated and interoperable. And so they delegated to what became the CIO Council the job of writing this thing. And in the Federal Enterprise Architecture is mentioned ESBs as a possible way to make software more interoperable. Now, if you know software at all, like ESBs were already kind of going out by 1995. It's sort of like not the thing. But the point is that everybody is telling him that it would be illegal to take this enterprise service bus out basically because Congress required it. But if you go talk to Congress, they're like, we absolutely have no idea what you're talking about. What has happened is that it is mentioned as an example in the Federal Enterprise Architecture, and so it got down to the DoD architecture, the Air Force architecture, into the requirements documents, and into the actual RFP that went out to vendors. Every step that it descended through this hierarchy, it just got more and more rigid. And that's what I call the cascade of rigidity. And it happens everywhere all the time. And it's why you have people on the ground saying, I don't have the authority to do this. But if you go talk to the people who wrote the laws that govern their job, they say, 100%, you do have the authority to do this. What is going on? And we have to start to figure out ways to break that cascade of rigidity.
But there's a second problem that raises, which is because of this cascade of rigidities, we've created a public culture in which people are brain dead. They don't actually think their job is to solve the problem. They're trying desperately to follow the rules in this labyrinth when the rules themselves don't fit together, often inconsistent. And so you have these people paralyzed instead of doing what, say, Elon Musk would do, which is roll up his sleeves and say, well, how do we get the signal down and distribute it?
Well, I mean, I also have stories in my book of public servants who do take that responsibility and say, no, I'm not going to take this incredibly literal, and I'm going to do the right thing. There is a fantastic project at CMS that delivered a law called MACRA, and they pushed back and said, it doesn't need to be this literal. We can make our own decisions here to get to the outcome that we think Congress intended, instead of this literal interpretation. Or I mean, it's not even literal. It's like a maximalist interpretation. But that's what happens, is that in each of those steps, someone says, my job is to get really specific. And in getting really specific, that's where that rigidity comes in. And you've got to train, but you get people on the delivery level who are going, I can see that the outcome is exactly the opposite of what Congress intended. I'm going to go push back on the people above me. What makes more sense is to have that not happen as it goes down.
Is there a cultural, underlying unconscious assumption in the federal government that you toured, or in the city and state governments that you tour, that sort of a Soviet-esque report up shipping many pounds of steel because, and even though the steel is just sitting there on the train going back and forth, is there a culture of just acceptance that's deeply ingrained, or are people rolling their eyes?
Find anything that works, and you'll have people like Jennifer's talking about. You have people who roll up their sleeves and make it work, notwithstanding the law. I had a friend who was head of procurement for the Navy, and he said, see those volumes, all those regulations? They sit up there, and we try to avoid getting in trouble, but basically we have meetings to decide what the right thing to do is. And that's what he did. But that's not how they're trained.
Let's go to the origin story of those volumes. So you described some well-meaning 1994 congressional thing about interoperability. Interoperability sounds good. Our systems should talk to each other. In fact, it was probably some panel just like this when systems weren't talking to each other that led to the policy of the systems being required to have an enterprise service bus in the first place.
We got nowhere on interoperability with the federal enterprise architecture.
For show, or the HCFA 1500, or countless other examples of standardization from the top. What makes us do this? What is the origin story? What is the root cause in our democracy today towards this proclivity?
The 1956 Interstate Highway Act was 29 pages long. 10 years later, 21,000 miles had been built. The last transportation bill, I forget, 1,000-page, implemented by thousands of pages of regulations, takes 10 years just to get approval. So
that's the searing insight first section. We're in the second section now.
So what happened was that we actually had a change in our our operating philosophy of government. It's not about policy. Think tanks argue about policy mainly. It's about operations. We had a change in our operating structure after the 60s, that we didn't trust anybody anymore. Computers were coming in, and some geniuses thought that we could actually tell people not only what to do, but how to do it. And life's just too complicated.
I'll give you three things.
Okay.
I think number one is we decided that policy is all that matters, and we don't pay much attention to operations.
Okay, I agree with
Operations is a second-class job in government, and it shouldn't be. Second, wait, what was my second one? Okay, it's incredibly adversarial, right? Like, I have this line about hiring in government. Like, the way we hire is absolutely bonkers, and it is not consistent with our stated merit system principles, which are strong and good, and we should support them, right? But the way it's been operationalized is in such a way that your judgment can't be questioned. I chose you as the candidate, but you can't question my judgment because I used no judgment.
Right.
And the reason we go—
I was fair. I was equitable. I didn't pick favorites.
I followed the process.
I didn't use my biases.
A very strict process. But why do we do that? Because of the constant criticism. And so in a certain sense, I think if somebody is to blame, it is a little bit the public and the press for constantly criticizing. There's a sense of incredible adversarialism. And if you are a public servant, if you're living day to day in the shoes of a public servant, you are just trying to defend against constant criticism. And we have decided that the way to do that is to follow process, even though it doesn't get the outcome that we intend, because then at least we can say, sorry, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
Right, and avoid responsibility, because any public decision worth its salt will disappoint someone.
Mm-hmm.
It'll permit somebody doesn't want to be given, a contract someone doesn't get. And so in a highly partisan and political environment, the field is plowed and fertilized with distrust. Whoever is disappointed creates this entire narrative of distrust. They go to their congressman, person's hauled before some congressional committee and criticized. And Jen and I have been talking about this. I think there needs to be a kind of an oversight body whose job is actually to protect and defend public officials who are actually making good choices. And I mean, because they are at this point in a partisan environment in a very difficult position.
We hear a lot about accountability.
Right.
We hear a lot about safety. There's always a law named after someone, Becky's Law. Oh, what building fell on Becky? Somebody did that to Becky. We can make sure there's never another Becky. So we build a law that has, no bricks will be, covered in rubber or whatever it is to protect the Becky, because we all want to be seen as on the side of safety and accountability. Was there a spike in this, though? Because in your books, you describe a spike in the sort of voluminousness of bureaucracy ad. I mean, if you look at our spending on government programs, and in Maine we make beautiful battleships. We used to make 7 to 10 a year at about 500 million each, and then it was 3 to 5 a year, and they kind of got to $1 billion. And currently we're banging out 2 whole ships at 2.8 billion each. What spiked in here?
It's a degenerative paralysis. I was reading the book about Elon Musk's SpaceX called Reentry, and he built his launch pad at Cape Canaveral using used, not leftover equipment and whatever. It's for a few $1 million. The contractors, the Lockheed Boeing, we spent like $500 million on theirs. And they have, for any important decision, they have a 500-page checklist they have to go through. We got this mindset that checklists would create correctness. In fact, if you look at the big scandals, like the 3 Mile Island, stuff was going wrong, but the technicians were just trained to follow the checklist, not to understand how it worked.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. And
So was 3 Mile Island, I mean, I just want to push on this inflection thing, and I want to go to your third example. Is this just a linear sort of like a bad event happens, we paper it over with more stuff, a bad event happens, we paper it over with more stuff, and we're just reaching kind of critical mass?
Like sediment in a harbor, law has grown really only for 50 years. It's now 150 million words, give or take, of binding federal law and regulation. It is almost never taken away. Jerry Brown, former Governor Brown, called me the other day out of the blue. He was giving a speech on too much law. He said, "Yeah, can you help me with this?" So I said, "Sure." He said, when I was governor, he was governor 16 years, they passed, only not compared to Maine, 1,000 laws a year. I said, well, how many were repealed? He said, I'm not sure, but maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And so you have this accretion of mandates that are increasingly granular. They're not just telling you, again, what to do, but it's like apple orchard. There's a rule that says you have to cover the apples when they're picked going to the barn where they're washed. And the idea is to protect them from bird droppings. They have to do that.
They've been on an apple tree for 2 years.
And keep a record of it. Now, those apples have been growing on the trees for 5 months. And
that should have been your first.
Nobody's been protecting them against birds for all those 5 months. I mean, so you have this sort of granularity. They had 5,000 rules that they were subject to at this orchard, 15 different government departments for a family-owned orchard, and inspectors who would come in once a year, and it's just making them pull their hair out. They just can't do their jobs.
Jennifer, what's your sense? Linear? Is it a logarithmic compound? What's your sense of this?
I think that
getting here?
I can't remember the guy's name. He's like the CEO of Palantir. Used the metaphor of compound interest, and I think that's a pretty good example. Because
what is it?
Compound interest,
Compound
essentially,
interest,
like so you look and you can see it in very specific cases. He was talking about the 5,000 series procurement in the DoD. It was originally 7 pages. How many years ago was that? And now it's couple thousand pages. And you can you see it go up just like compound interest, because every year people need to add to
Right.
it.
So a doctor calls up, they can't get reimbursed. I'm talking to a friend of mine who used to be the president of Johns Hopkins, who's a doctor. Can't get reimbursed, keeps bouncing back and forth, finally gets a real person on the phone. And why do you keep bouncing my form? Because you didn't check the box that you asked the patient whether she had been a smoker. There's all these really lengthy forms, like healthcare. And the doctor said,
that's why you weren't paid for your broken ankle.
I didn't check the box because the patient was 2 years old. And so you have these systems in place where the smartest people try to imagine everything that could go wrong. And it turns out everybody's going around through their lives with their noses in the rule books.
Well, let me make the slight case for checklists, in part because Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto is such a great book. But there's a great concept in the Navy: back of sub, front of sub. Back of sub, you use the checklist, and you do not deviate, because otherwise very bad things happen. That's where the nukes are. Front of sub, you're navigating in dark waters and you don't know what's going on. You have to adjust. You have to make judgment calls. And the problem is, and I think there is a place for back of sub culture, but when back of sub culture gets in the front of sub, it's just as bad as the other way around.
There's a science for this, which is that when one little mistake would cause the difference between the word, it'll occur to me in a second. When one little mistake can cause a tragedy, like in a nuclear submarine, or you're operating on the wrong leg if you're a doctor or something, it's very important to have checklists, or you're flying a plane, to make sure you haven't forgotten unlock the flaps, right? Because one little mistake, and it's very important to have that done. But it doesn't, but once you fly, you're flying. You're not doing the checklist. And the difference between complex activities and complicated activities. Complicated, you need checklists to make sure you don't screw it up. Complex, you need to use your judgment and make trade-offs and risk and timing and all that kind of stuff.
And you have to adjust in real time.
And you have to adjust in real time.
Really increasing skill and competency that we need in government. We just sort of get orders and then execute them, very rigidly, without the feedback loops that we need to build. And that's part of
but there's a human
in your
thing.
Airplane example, there is enormous process around adding another checklist, because there's enormous data about what happens to compliance with the whole checklist as each item is added. And God forbid you want to add a ding, because a lot of dings and the pilot's not flying anymore.
Right.
It doesn't seem as though the pressure on each additional checkbox exists in government. What do we?
Pressure not to add another.
Yeah, like whoa! If you're going to add that checklist,
it's nothing but
we got to
a
take
checklist.
another one out, right? It seems like there's no concern in the Creation Act of sort of total impact on compliance or effectiveness. What do we do from here? We're in a change of government. What are the policy changes, large and small, that can give us a little purchase on this compounding chaos?
I just want to say there's a great line that one of our designers at Code for America had, which is, anytime you want to add a question to like a school form, go watch a mom trying to fill that form while she's trying to break up a fight between two toddlers with her other hand.
Yeah, great.
Right. Well, I think my answer to the question is you have to put humans in charge again.
Okay.
So it's not against systems, but systems are a tool for humans who are charged with accomplishing a task, with buying the IT system that works and implementing it, or whatever it happens to be. And instead we have a government that ostensibly humans are there and they have responsibility, but except for the ones who basically are renegades, which is all the ones who get stuff done, they're trained to follow a fixed route of march, as if they were, Frederick Winslow Taylor's Scientific Management, where you tell exactly how to pick up the pig iron and load it and all that kind of stuff. It's on that kind of phony presumption that governing is in most cases, is too complicated.
Let's call that your strategic intent, right?
Right.
To go from this is how to this is what we want. What do we do in this in political inflection point right now. What policy? Do we go with Schedule F and give people more power to cut bureaucrats? Each administration gets to cut some percent. Do we line item veto? Do we? What are the things that you guys imagine, having studied this so closely, would get the most kind of consequential, compounding, reverse impact on this creep that's killing us?
It's not about, go ahead.
I want to put this topic of deproceduralization in context, because I think it's one of about 4 things that we need to do. So Ben Bain, who's here with me, works at Niskanen Center. He and I are working on a paper. And what we're really saying is if you want government to be able to achieve its policy goals, you need 4 things. You need the right workforce. You need people hire and fire the right people. I don't think Schedule F is the right solution to that personally. I don't think it addresses the merit issues that are a problem right now. But it's also not just firing, it's hiring. And I have, I could bend your ear for an hour on that.
Your critique with Schedule F is it feels more like Soviet political officer stuff than idiot never getting fired stuff?
Well, it only applies to a certain set of positions, and it basically is going to function, to me, it looks like it functions as a loyalty test, not a merit test.
So what if Schedule F actually said, no, it's not that, it's every employee, you can't fire more than some 1%, so you can't do a pogrom, call it 5%, but it's based on performance of the employee, and it's up to the judgment of the executive. Would that?
I mean, that's going back to our merit system principles, which is great.
Okay.
So the way I think about it is the foundation is strong, but the building or the edifice that's been built on top of the foundation needs to be pulled all the way back to the studs and rebuilt, because all of that cascade of rigidity has gotten way out of control in the way that we've operationalized civil service, but not in the foundation. The foundation says, let's hire and fire based on merit, let's promote based on merit, there should be a degree of independence so that someone can say, but the science says, I want to keep that. So, keep the foundation, rebuild everything on top of it. I actually think that what I'm saying is pretty radical. I'm not saying let's keep what we have now, because what I want bears very little resemblance to the way that it works today. I just like those merit system principles, and I think we should keep them.
So Philip, the
that was
Schedule
only
F
one.
#Pahlka.
Yeah.
What are the other 3?
Okay. The second one is thanks, Philip.
I want to get your reaction to the first one.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
No,
We get to 3 and then he'll react.
Right.
Okay. The second one is essentially what we've been talking about, is if you've got the right people, you have to burden them less. And I do want to point out that I completely agree with Philip. We add and we very, very rarely subtract. But now we're starting to see examples of people going out there and trying to figure out what we can subtract. There are regulatory lookbacks that are happening now, aided with LLMs, that I think are really promising. We're doing some work on that at Niskanen as well. There are, I think, increasing awareness by legislators at the federal and state level that they can't just keep throwing everything on the books. These bill mills are so dangerous. And then we've got a bunch of policy proposals around things like the Paperwork Reduction Act, which I always insist be called the comically misnamed Paperwork Reduction Act.
Like the
because all it
Anti-Inflation
does
Act, which
is
created
add
12%.
paperwork.
Yeah.
So deproceduralization is the second one. The third one follows on from the last session very much. Invest in data and digital infrastructure, which is just needed to make everything easier. And then the fourth one is close the loop. And I talked about this earlier. We have this sort of waterfall system in which there's, congressional or legislative or executive intent, and then it goes through the cascade of rigidity, and what comes at the other end doesn't make any sense to anybody. And that's because open loop systems don't work. Everything that you like in your daily lives today works because there's a feedback loop built into it, a constant, ongoing feedback loop. And we need to take this moment when I think both the executive branch and the legislative branch both recognize that their operating models fundamentally are outdated and don't work, and say, great, both of those are broken. Let's create a new operating model that puts legislative and executive branch in a tight closed loop feedback system so that we can have those adjustments that Philip was talking about earlier.
So Philip, how do you react to those 4? Are those the 4 And if so, how do they actually get manifested? Or are they not the 4 and there's others?
No, I think those 4 are great. The question is how to get from here to there. So I think that having a series of pilot projects, for example, in procurement at DoD, using AI as a kind of a check on things and creating after the fact oversight rather than, because there's so much distrust, years of process. And so give to a small group of procurement officers the authority to actually negotiate and work on and implement the contracts. Give some oversight body, if we're distrustful, the chance to approve really big contracts so that they can't just do it unilaterally, and use modern technology in ways that both help them make their decisions and also help look at the decisions afterwards and see how they've done. And you can do pilot projects in a whole range of areas that don't require you to wipe the laws and all the regulations off the book immediately. And going to Jen's point about closing the loop, really important that people feel that their work is judged by how it actually affects people. It isn't just complying. So you have this sort of compliance model, and you have this sense of Washington as a gear spinning round and round, largely disconnected from the society it's supposedly governing. It's taking
Totally
a life
different world through the looking glass. Yeah.
And part of the problem is Congress. And so, I've recommended that there be a protocol in Congress that gives much more authority to committees to oversee regulations, not just laws, but regulations. And if some supermajority of the committee and the minority leader agree with their proposed changes, the protocol would be all of Congress would vote for it without debate. And just give back the authority to start taking stuff away.
We talk a little bit about this report that we have coming out about the fact that different systems have these better feedback loops already built in. I think you're getting at a way to do that. I can't remember what it's called, but in the UK, maybe somebody here will know, they have this sort of like really easy way to adjust bills that have our, legislation, and they do about 4,000 of them a year. There are certainly fix-it bills that happen, but they're not happening because, somebody in agency was like, hey, we learned something, let's go tell Congress. Like, that's just not the culture we have.
And instead we have this kind of blind acceptance of law. Law is good. Law is the basis of freedom. More law is better. Right, and so now we've got so much law that, that nobody can have. Law has invaded the field of freedom. It's not a framework.
Are there burgeoning questions bubbling? Okay, we have a few. Can we have the mic mafia out with the new approach where you fill up the mics and then? That was so fast that we'll start with the questions right now.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Chandler, and I work at the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. My question has to do with why don't we use AI, you mentioned AI, to look at all of the regulations to see what are conflicting, first of all, and what is the regulatory cost? Pick a specific person and ask that AI to come up with what's the regulatory cost to that particular person. I think he would have a huge argument to the American people what would come of it. And AI is so agnostic. It doesn't matter. It's going to give you an answer.
So we are doing that. We're partnered with the Stanford Reg Lab, fantastic AI experts. I think what we're starting really with, so I think you can look at conflicting, you can look at duplicative, de minimis. There's like a whole set of sort of categories of regulations and rules that just like you could take them away and no one cares, right? It's like they just disappear and no one even was looking at them. And those are obviously the least controversial ones. And so the Reg Lab looked at racial covenants in Santa Clara County. And it was like they could find thousands of these things. They're just like, nobody wants this in here anymore, and they were able to take them out. I think when you start to get to stuff that's less, that's a little bit more controversial, then you have the political will problem. But, let's start with just showing how easy it is to find stuff and reduce the size, just the sheer volume of regulation. I think it makes a difference. Shout out to the Army. So they have a project. This is not regulatory. Sorry, am I going over?
No, I'm just. taking the shout out on
Oh,
behalf
we're
of my
shouting. Yes,
1
shout out
million
to the
fellow
Army. So
Army alums.
they identify that, it's not just that they can't negotiate these contracts, it's that they have years and years of requirements that have been built up that they have to put in all of their RFPs, like the enterprise service bus. And they said, let's distinguish between things that are war-winning capabilities and additive capabilities, and realize that if we try to get our contractors to deliver on literally all of these capabilities, you have no competition, nobody can fulfill that contract, it's billions of dollars instead of millions. Let's just focus on the war-winning capabilities. So they had to go get rid of 54 different requirements documents to get down to something that they realized was actually, the true product that they wanted. I don't know if they used LLMs in this case, but they did roll back 54 requirements documents. And we ought to be like shouting that from the rooftops, celebrating it, thanking them, and getting other public servants to do the same.
There is a problem of inconsistency, contradictory. I think it's basically illegal to build anything in this country, but because you can't comply, too many compliance.
We'll get the Army on it.
Yeah, but exactly. but a lot of it is the secretion problem, like with environmental reviews, where there's a law that says you must consider and try to have minimal impact on endangered species. You must consider and have minimal impact on historic buildings. You must consider, and so that's why all these consultants are around doing all this stuff, not focusing on, we really need this bridge to get fixed, or whatever. And so there's no prioritizing, and there's no authority, to do trade-offs. And we have all these rules like privacy in healthcare. I'm for privacy in healthcare, but mainly I want the doctors and nurses to take care of me, more than privacy. So how much are we paying, and how much are we diverting healthcare providers? Where do all those forms go? Is there some file cabinet in heaven that holds all the forms that we've all signed every time we go there? And so there needs to be kind of a reassessment, kind of rebooting back to the studs, in Jennifer's point, in all these systems so that they can work effectively.
Joel, is the other mic in play or is it sleeping? Oh, it's in play. Okay, Joel.
Quick question around risk aversion. How much of this is due to people not willing to take risks? So for instance, at Athena, when we ever had an incident, we would have a retro and people would throw out ideas about changes to process or tools that we could do to stop the next incident. But then we would also have an evaluation of those to say, how much of that is going to hurt us in a normal case? And are we willing to accept a certain amount of risk to be able to keep moving as fast as we were?
Well, there's a thing that Jennifer mentioned, which is the risk of taking responsibility within government. So there's that problem. There's a risk, I think I'm probably the only person who's written about this, in a system of justice, civil justice, that allows anybody who's disappointed to sue for almost anything, the cost of which isn't lots of crazy verdicts, the cost of which is this incredible culture of defensiveness, where businesses won't give job references, you name it. Everybody says, well, what if somebody sues? So that needs to get fixed. I'm trying to convince the American Law Institute to actually do forums on this, because we think the American system of justice is great. It is impartial, that's good, but it's also supposed to stand for something, like rules of reasonableness, what's good care and what's not. Doctors ought to know that as a matter of law, not within reasonable guidelines, not be subjected to a $20 million lawsuit whenever there's a bad outcome. So risk is a problem, and we have to come up with mechanisms, depending on who's being risk averse, to make people trust the system again.
I mean, in the tech world, the best practice after an incident is an incident is a blameless postmortem, right? And that is how you get to figure out really what happened, and you don't end up adding all of this cruft on top that then slows you down. Can you imagine getting pulled up in front of Congress and saying, yes, thank you, sir, we ran a blameless postmortem, you're gonna get killed. But that is actually how good software in the private sector is built. And it is, we would have to change the culture of oversight in our government to allow for that.
That's what good hospitals do too.
Mm-hmm.
We have one question here, and as you answer it, I have a big announcement to make. Former board member of FREOPP, Vivek Ramaswamy, is joining us today. Come on out, Vivek.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vivek Ramaswamy. And what I'd like you to do, I'm running the Doge, I invented the Doge, my forehand's amazing, and I will implement whatever you say. I have the ear of the president and the soul of the public. I will implement one discrete and specific policy. We're going to start with a question, we'll answer the question, and then each of you, we will end on time, right into the cocktails with the specific Ramaswamyan implementation ringing in our ears.
One of the ideas that's been floated for permitting reform is to sort of arbitrarily say, there has to be a yes or no decision on permitting reform within a year or 2 years, just getting an arbitrary timeline. How effective is that, and might it carry over to bureaucracies where you simply say, well, you can't issue any more regulations other than 1,000 pages of regulations per bureaucracy,
right.
Or you can't take up more time for a small business.
Sure,
X
one
amount of
in,
time.
one out, all that kind of stuff. None of them work. I advocated and testified about time limits on environmental review and permitting. They don't work because they conflict with thousands of other mandates. So it's just paralysis. So what I think Vivek is getting wrong is it's not about firing people, it's about changing the underlying systems so that you don't need people pushing paper. You actually give responsibility to people to actually do their jobs. Then you don't need all this stuff, but you can't just fire them. That's just paralysis.
I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, you actually could end up in a situation, like let's say you fire half the people, now you have half the compliance staff.
Same
to get
amount of
through the
bureaucracy,
same
but no
amount
one to
of
carry the
paperwork.
water.
You could actually really slow stuff down. I mean, you cannot make an agency go faster by telling them to if you don't make it easier for them to do it. You've got to have the right people, you've got to reduce the burdens on them, they've got to have the digital and data infrastructure, and they have to be able to close the loop with the people above them.
Right, and the authority, one of the problems with Schedule F, which I think needs a speed bump to make sure people don't live in terror, and it just creates more risk aversion, basically.
Wait a minute, you're prescribing the process here?
Is the biggest
Did you just
problem.
do process prescription?
The biggest problem, what?
Did you just do process prescription? Isn't that
accusing
an
you of,
anathema to you to describe?
No, well, the biggest problem with Schedule F is that the people he wants to fire don't have management authority over the people who work for them. So it's the unmanageability of the whole system that's the reason it's not delivering. Sometimes people drag their heels and fire them, if they're not obeying lawful mandates. But you've got to empower those seniors. My biggest supporters are the people of the Senior Executives Association, because they don't have the authority to manage the people underneath them.
So let's end with this. Vivek Ramaswamy has granted you one wish, one law, reg, that will begin the reverse osmosis of this compounding chaos.
Are you assuming Vivek gets Congress to pass it?
Yep.
Okay.
He's going to pass it.
He's going to pass it.
He has pictures. He knows things.
Okay.
He will get it passed.
Okay, I'll give you mine.
You've got both houses. I mean, it's not unrealistic.
I get it.
We're going to create a recodification commission with the job of taking it down to the studs on a radically simplified governing framework that's activated by officials, human officials, taking responsibility and being accountable. Okay. And this recodification commission has 2 years to come up with a proposal for the simplified model, and then it goes to Congress for vote.
Okay. It's the Manhattan Project of directly responsible individual leadership.
Yes.
We're going to do it. We're going to come in and say, Joe owns this. He's allowed to do what he needs to do like a general in combat. Front of ship. Front of sub.
Front of sub.
Okay, what's yours? Well, I'll evaluate yours against.
Well, no, we're not competing, we're partners.
No. I've got to create a little tension. We're trying to hold the room for 2 more seconds.
There's a lot of tension because I have like more than one.
Only one. Vivek
Okay.
is here for only one.
This isn't going to do everything, but it would be a start
That's all I'm
towards
looking for.
important deproceduralization. Can't even say the word. Reform the Paperwork Reduction Act or repeal it.
Reform it or repeal the Paperwork Reduction Act.
Yes.
Which actually may be a partnered type.
Yeah, it says a partner thing. It's part of what you would get rid of.
Classic
Yeah.
Jen and
They're just
Philip.
too freaking kind to each other. That's the problem. Thank you all for joining us. And please thank you, Jennifer. And please thank Jennifer and Philip for my favorite subject.